Thank you folks for coming tonight. Over the years we've done worship, we've done book studies, and earlier this winter I got thinking that marriage has been such a hot topic in the church and in the news in the last several months that we ought to talk about marriage. And the more I got thinking about it, I realized that all the sacraments are worth talking about, and we're coming up with fresh ways in which to apply them and questions about them. Can everybody hear well, or should I use this?
You're better.
Just in case. We've got it here, so we'll see how it works. First question I wanted to ask was, so what's...
Ron can't hear you, so go ahead, use it.
What's the purpose of religion? What's the purpose of religion? Why are we the church?
At church. Fellowship of believers, I
A
think.
fellowship of believers. What else? What is the purpose of religion?
A set of beliefs.
Set of beliefs. I'm going to start copying these down. Set of beliefs. Carol, the fellowship of
Believers.
Fellowship of believers. What else?
Expression of gratitude and love.
Remember what Marx said? Karl, not Hartwell. It's the opiate of the masses. What he was saying was it's something to lull the people into sleep, to get them to go along with whatever you're doing, and realize that Marx had actually studied to be a Russian Orthodox priest and was expelled from seminary. So take that for whatever it's worth. What else?
It's an extension of the spiritual world into the physical world.
Spiritual into physical. Okay. Others?
Well, I think to be provoked and inspired that you can't really do in your own Bible study at home. And they're provoked and inspired by the Word.
Great. Max Weber, who, along with Neil Durkheim, is where we get sociology and much of social scientific theory, described back at the turn of the 1800s into the 1900s that it's about the routinization of charisma. Routinization of charisma. What does that mean?
I was going to ask you then. I know what charisma means, but I
Okay.
don't know what the routinization means.
What's routinization?
Beginning.
Routinization would be to make it regular, to make it...
Okay,
Is that
routine.
directing or something?
So the idea is that you have an experience in your life. And it's been an experience of the spiritual. We had earlier extension of the spiritual to the physical. You have a monumental experience, a life-changing experience. How do you make sure that your children have that same experience? The routinization of charisma was to try to set up catechism classes, to try and set up worship experiences, to try to do things so that the next generation would have the same experience that we do. You remember that the Pilgrims, when they were, the Mayflower, had the Mayflower Compact. And before they actually came onto the soil, they made a compact with each other as to what things they would do together and how they would live, what the society would all be about. And included in there was that if you had a religious experience, you could be baptized. If you had not had a religious experience, you could not be baptized. And they had certain hallmarks for what that religious experience was to be. And they set up a tribunal that would judge people as to whether it was fake or whether it was real. And the difficulty was their children didn't have the same religious experience that they had. And so they set up a new covenant that was called the halfway covenant that said that if one or the other of your parents had a religious experience that could be proven, then you could be baptized. And by the third generation, they disbanded the whole thing. The Shakers were a religion that you could not be born into. The only way in which you became a Shaker was by conversion. And after conversion, after you'd had that religious experience and the catechism that went along with it, then you would be baptized, and then you would be part of the Shakers. Has anybody ever met a Shaker? It's a good reason for that. They all died off.
Oh,
Really?
well,
Not
yeah,
enough
you can't be
people-
going into it and.
You can't be born into it. Not enough people had the same experience,
Yeah.
and it just died out.
Self-extinction.
Exactly. They also did not practice sex. They practiced celibacy, which is part of the reason why you couldn't be born into it. So the sacraments. What are the sacraments?
Just a quick question
Yeah.
about religion.
Yeah.
What about religion drives people to such extremes?
Good question. Anybody else want to offer before I jump into this? What about religion drives people to such extremes?
There's zealousness.
Zealous? It's always a question as to how serious we take this and how much we apply it. Is faith, is religion something of the mind? Is it a philosophy and an intellectual pursuit? Is it a way of life? And how do you interpret it? I heard last week a new book that has come out about Islam and ISIL. And the danger of this is a people who believe in the apocalypse. And they believe that they have a role in bringing the apocalypse on. How do you fight with somebody who wants to see the end of the world? But that's their interpretation. That is not Islam, but that's their interpretation of Islam. And Christianity, Judaism have each had their zealots at different times in our histories. The Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition reached times of horrendous experience from the Christians, and the KKK came out of Christianity originally. We wouldn't want to claim these today, but it is their origins, from being people who took their faith very, very seriously and a piece of that is to the exclusion of other people. The belief that if you're not of our group, if you're not of our baptism or communion, then you are heathen. There are still communities today that practice shunning. As Presbyterians, we're the only denomination that still does not have a book of prayer, but does have a book of discipline. What's a book of discipline for? Rules. Well, we've got a book of government that are the rules.
Punishment.
The discipline is how do we enforce this? And it gets into audits as well as when there's misconduct. And it could be for members, it could be for elders and deacons, it can also be for pastors. And all of us have a judgment in this. If there's a problem in the local church, the way in which that is decided in the local church is in the session, meets as the jury. And the pastor serves as the presiding judge, tries to be neutral. If it happens at the Presbyterian or higher level, then there's a governing disciplinary commission that's put together for it. Did that get enough, Ed? Because this is a major issue in the world today, are people who are saying, my religion is telling me I have to do this, and everyone else are heathens, and kill them all off. And other parts of the world where religion has become so secularized, we've taken it so much for granted that everyone is acceptable, that it's dropped out.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with just extreme passion. And also part of it might be what you said, like Marx said, the opiate of the masses, the rulers or the leaders on high really are able to recruit people to their cause.
And nothing sells like success. So if other people are joining, you want to join in as well. The routinization of charisma is important here because we live in a revolutionary time in our society. I can remember as a child, we wanted to have longer hair. We'd had crew cuts. I didn't know I had curly hair until I was 16 years of age. Because every Saturday night, we were lined up and had a crew cut. And suddenly the Beatles came out. And suddenly everybody wanted to have, and the Beatles had, my hair would be about as long as the Beatles' hair was at the time. And then it got longer and longer styles. But we're in a time of challenging. Do we want to do things the way in which our parents did? Do we accept their values? Do we accept their customs? I was visiting with friends out in California this summer when we visited our son Nate, and they said the difference between the East Coast and the West Coast is on the East Coast you value history. On the West Coast we have the same priority as you have for history for innovation. Whatever is new, whatever is something different, not the norm. That's what so it's countercultural. That raises a whole different set of expectations for the church. Is the church about doing what's always been done, or is the church about doing something that's new? What's the role of orthodoxy? What is orthodoxy? The traditional way, the way in which it's always been done becomes orthodox. And part of being reformed is that we believe that as those who were reformed, those who went through change once, we always have to keep revisiting it to make sure we're still current, that we have not become heretical or so stayed in our beliefs that we need a new reformation all over again. So part of the difficulty with that charisma, with those religious experiences, is it's always working in polar opposite directions, towards greater and greater authority and towards greater and greater dissolution, where you're not going to have those experiences at all. The Catholic Church tends to represent orthodoxy, tends to represent those traditions and the values of doing things the same way in which it's been done. There's been a rise in the last decade of having services done in Latin, simply because it's, much like we were talking before about having vinyl records, it's because it's holy, it's traditional, it feels right for church, it feels sacred, not because the people understand it, or because they're getting something different out of it, it just feels more churchy. A sacrament. What is a sacrament?
A ritual to consecrate a belief or a time in one's faith journey?
Ritual or
Ceremony?
ceremony? Ceremony to consecrate
A time in one's faith journey. Sorry.
You're fine. And I'm sure you can't read my scribbles either. But as we're saying them, maybe it'll help to remember what they are. Others?
A godly event.
That's a rite, right?
A rite or ritual?
Yep.
A special time.
Do you remember the seminary definition?
That was
An external event of an internal experience or feeling. A sacrament is external. It's something other people can see. You may have that religious experience, you may have that feeling, but how do you do it in a way so that it can be replicated, so that other people can participate in it? One of the things that was going on during the Middle Ages was that they were celebrating the sacrament, celebrating communion in churches, and every church celebrated it. And part of the excitement for the masses, for the people who didn't understand what was going on, was to try to see communion as many times in a day as you could. Why would you want to? What are you seeing in communion? bread and wine, which is
The body and blood of Christ.
you are seeing Jesus. So if you could see Jesus as many times as possible, wouldn't that be a good thing? And so people would literally run from one church to another, not getting anything out of it except seeing that it was taking place, but not participating. And this is part of what Luther and Calvin got upset with, and why we had the Reformation, was to, one of the most basic pieces, one I didn't realize until after I was already ordained. What's the major difference between the Catholic and Protestant churches in our worship?
The number of sacraments?
The number of sacraments is part of it. We'll come back to that one.
Oh, we have different Bibles.
Actually, anymore, that's gotten closer and closer because they're not being published by the denominations anymore. There used to be a Catholic Bible, and there were Protestant Bibles, but now it's Zondervan or Cambridge, Oxford. What else?
The Catholics believe in the transubstantiation, which means that the bread and wine are actually changed into the body and blood of Christ, whereas most other religions just believe that they're symbols of God's
Okay,
presence.
we'll come back to that when we get into communion more, with explanations to what we believe and where we got to this. But as
Generally can be the purpose of the minister who is officiating the worship and the role of the member who is witnessing the worship or is being part of the worship.
role of minister and role of members. What I'm really going for is, what do you have to have in order to have the Catholic Mass?
Confession. Better have a priest.
The priest to do
legal
what?
priest.
You've got to have a priest, and the priest has got to do what? Celebrate communion.
Yeah.
Can we have worship without having communion?
Yes.
When we have worship, do we have a sermon? The Presbyterian Church in particular, the Protestants in general, were much more into the sermon, and the Catholics were more into the communion. And the basis of the Catholic Church is all about the Mass, is all about communion, where ours is all about the understanding of it. And we can't celebrate communion without having the sermon. They can't celebrate, they can't have a sermon, can't have a worship service without having communion. A different priority system. Okay? Going back to where are you going to meet God? Are you going to meet God in your mind and in your experience, or in participation in communion? Which is why the confession and forgiveness are so important here for the Catholic Church. Don also mentioned the number of sacraments. How many sacraments does the Catholic Church have?
Said 7.
7 sacraments. How many do the Presbyterians have?
2.
What's the difference? Do we celebrate 2 that they don't celebrate? We celebrate 2 that they do. 2 of the 7 are the ones we celebrate. What are the 2 we celebrate?
Baptism.
Baptism and communion.
Right.
Okay. Why are these 2 different than all the rest? I see Judy counting, trying to figure out what the 7 are.
They are.
They were the 2 that Jesus did.
They're the 2 that, and where do we know that Jesus did them? What record do we have?
The Bible.
The Gospels. The 4 Gospels all say that Jesus was baptized and that Jesus celebrated communion. Despite what the Da Vinci Code tells us, we don't have evidence Jesus was actually married. We have evidence he was at Lazarus' raising from the dead. They took him down from the cross and placed him into the tomb, but they were coming on Easter morning to anoint his body with oils. So the idea of a funeral is not something that we have evidence Jesus ever led or actually received. Do we have evidence Jesus was ever ordained? He was anointed. The voice comes from heaven, but not ordained. So what are the sacraments? Name them.
Extreme
7.
unction. Extreme unction.
And what is extreme unction?
The blessing for the dead.
Last rites.
Yes.
We're going to come up with several different names for that. What else?
Marriage, you say?
Marriage,
Baptism.
baptism,
Communion.
Confession.
Ordination, you mentioned that?
Is penance one?
they had to come back to confession.
Or, yes.
Confirmation.
Confirmation. Okay. What are we trying to do with these 7 different events?
Identify stages of one's journey.
These are stages in your life.
Teresa's point.
Is having a baby a big experience? Does it change your life?
Sure.
Is it important to your family?
Yep.
Is a funeral an important family event? An important community event? Is marriage? So each of these were major events in the community's life or in the individual's life, and in trying to pass on those religious experiences, those spiritual experiences, to the next generation, we created rituals that went with them so that we could embody those experiences. But with those, the priorities have changed over time. In Africa, in Latin America, and in America, in North America, prior to the 1920s, what was the major part of the wedding service? What's the major priority of it? Probably what?
The vows, probably, but
Actually,
the party.
prior to, that's where it's gone now, is the party afterwards. And from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, as people started writing their own, the vows became the most important part. Prior to the 1920s in North America, or in Africa today,
Oh, the dowry.
it's the dowry negotiation, which the leftover, the residual event that we have today is the I do question. Do you wish to get married? I do. Do we have your parents' blessing? We do. Do you use the community to bless this? We do. It used to be that was the whole wedding. Co would have come to church and been seated with all the single men. Ann would have come to church and been seated with all the single women. And he saw this woman, he wanted to date her. And dating was always chaperoned. And dating was monogamous. And dating was leading towards marriage. So we would assign a chaperone to go with the two of you. And Ann actually didn't get to come for the negotiation at all. Ann's father would come, and Co would come, and Co would be asked, what are your intentions? And I would have loved to be part of that conversation. And this is where the dowry would be negotiated and agreed upon in front of the church, the session of the church, to make sure this was good for the families and good for the community. If so, you were then given the chaperone who would guide you through your courtship to say, now's when you need to make her dinner, now's when you want to bring in flowers, to guide you through. There's a book that's been popular for the last 2 or 3 decades, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. What it really says is men and women speak different shorthand. Part of Maria and I the last 6 months has been getting accustomed to each other's shorthand, so we can anticipate what the other needs and how to cross-ruff with each other. It's part of a partnership. It's part of a marriage. And understanding when the other gets upset by something. What are the things that are going to push their buttons? Since the 1920s, that's become a less important piece in American culture. You would come back for your stating of your vows as a second ceremony, and the whole community would turn out, and a third ceremony would be a blessing of the bands. And if at that point, when you could afford to buy gold, you also had children, we'd have a baptism of the children. So these were 3 totally separate celebrations. We've merged the 3 into one.
Unless it's a Sudanese wedding.
Unless it's a Sudanese wedding where it's still a negotiation.
It was too.
Wow, boy, that was something.
And part of the fun of that was that they ended right at the right time. And I thought, they're singing a hymn, they're having a prayer, we're ready to go. And John got in the car and drove away. because it would be presumptuous for the bride to be here during the negotiations if it didn't work out right. So it was just family celebration and family negotiation as part of this. We still do all of these different things, but we have different priority for them and different ways in which they're being done. Just to give you a tip-off of where things are coming with this in the next several weeks throughout Lent, we have had different applications and different understandings about authority and what the rites are about. Who gets to decide if you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong with the sacraments? Who's to decide?
Presiding minister?
If the church has authority, then the minister decides. If people don't believe in the church, if they don't agree with that faith, they make it up to themselves. Is it possible today for you to perform weddings?
Well, it's all the legal issues, and the lawyers decide everything from prenups and marriages and da-da-da-da, as opposed to it being a church event.
So we're putting greater authority on the legal. In biblical times, how did you get divorced? Mentioning legal.
Thank you. I think it depends on which faith you.
In biblical times, you're going to be Judaism. I should have been more clear.
Maybe somebody sent you off to war and you just happened to be dead.
Well, that's the Uriah story, yes.
Sorry.
Shooting.
I'm sorry, that's how you get divorced. That's like,
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, Judy.
Say it 3 times and stomp your feet, like I divorced you,
Yes.
I divorced you. Do you stomp your feet or?
And who do you
But
say
only
it in
men
front
can
of?
do that.
You're right, ex-wife.
In the presence of the ex-wife, but in front of whom?
Oh,
Who's the authority?
I don't know.
The rabbi?
The rabbi. They're the ones who married you. They're the ones who officiated the divorce. And a woman couldn't divorce a man couldn't divorce a woman. Why is it in America in the 1920s that we started to make shifts in weddings from the dowries and the vow and the I do question to the vows and the reception afterwards?
Evolving women's rights?
1920s, women got rights. And suddenly,
vote.
and with the vote and all the different rights that started to come with this, women began to say, I'm not property to be bought and sold by my father to this man. I want to be able to decide for myself. Love should have a role in this. That's different than other cultures have had. And it's now spreading throughout the world. But as you question authority, it then questions the authority of the church and whether people continue to practice the way in which they have. In recent years, the last 2 years, I've had 3 occasions where families have had a death of somebody who lived in central New York, who had moved to Florida, and they had the funeral in Florida, and they shipped the remains to Skaneateles. And Bob Gray and I were asked if we would go to the cemetery to have the graveside.
They have what?
The graveside service, the funeral,
Oh,
the actual burial. Okay? Who's this for? Is it for the dead body? Is it for God? Is it for the minister?
It's for the
it's
family.
for the
It's for
family.
the family. And so the idea of, and the community, but the idea that the funeral director and the minister are going to have a special worship service by ourselves is very 21st century.
Just
and a little
the
bizarre.
two of you?
Just the 2 of us.
No
That
kidding.
we would go because when you bury, say a prayer. And the idea that they're not buried appropriately if they didn't have that prayer over them. So in the Catholic Church, the intriguing part is that all of these come back to communion. And you celebrate communion with each of those. With baptism, you would have communion. With confession, you'd have communion. With funeral, you'd have communion. But in the Presbyterian Church, these are separate events. We do all of them, but we only claim the 2 as being sacraments. And that's because we have evidence in the Gospels that Jesus did these. So what I'd like for you to think about this week, as we're getting ready for next Wednesday to join together, is among these 7 things, how different would you celebrate them? What are the important things that you would do to celebrate them? And is there anything else in the world today, in your life experience, that you would want to have? Is graduation, is getting your driver's license, getting your first computer, getting your cell phone? It's a holy experience to peel that plastic off. What are the, you can talk to your son about that, I'll tell you. He insisted when I got my first Mac that I had to open it. He couldn't open it for me. Think about the sacraments and what are the things you're trying to express, for whom. What other events would you want to do here? We're going to be videotaping this each week so we can put it up on the website for people who haven't been part of this. The last couple of years I've kept notes that we've given the next week to those who weren't here. Now you'll be able to go to the church website and be able to say, so what did they do last week? And get an update. For those who are in Florida or California, they'll be able to keep tabs as to what's going on.
You know, back in Holland, many people didn't get married in church. They just got married in the short of.
Before the civil,
Yeah, in the civil court. Yeah, that's all they did.
having traveled, when it was the Soviet Union, having traveled through Russia, they would still get married before the state, but they insisted on wearing a white dress, carrying flowers, and having a tuxedo on the groom.
Yeah.
At which point you would go to one of the national monuments, that was usually to the dead, for photos.
Oh.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. I
It was
witnessed that.
still the wedding ceremony, the photos and the dress, but it was all taking place at statues and before the magistrate, instead of in the church.
Yeah, because I very seldom did they get married in church. Of course, they always have to do the civil marriage first, and then if they did want to do it in the church, that was afterwards.
And this has raised a lot of new questions for the churches today of actually, Mario and I, when we do weddings, are fulfilling a legal function.
Yeah.
We are recognized public characters. We're known. So we can sign in this. So when I go into the bank, I don't have to show ID because I'm a public official. People know who you are. We'll come back to this and have fun with it. Bruce?
I have a question, well, I guess several questions. One is, in the Middle Ages, people didn't bother getting married. I mean, they just simply lived together. And after X number of years, I thought then it was considered legal. Is that?
This is where we got common law marriages.
Yes.
However, the royalty got married.
Right.
The common people
Well,
did
that was
not.
because of property issues.
Property, and what else goes along with
Well,
property?
and the succession of the...
Inheritance.
Well, but also whether the kids could be king or the next king.
You want to make sure who the father is
Yeah.
of this child so that you can determine are they royalty or not. Whereas common people, they didn't care. The wife cared. Okay. Who would like to make soup next week? We usually have 2. Ann? Teresa? Great. Thank you. If there are other things that you want us to do during this Lenten season, I think this is a good way to reflect. We've had a recurrent question. It's come up at Bible study. It's come up a couple other places in the life of the church of what does this matter? Why are we doing this? Bible study, it's great to study the Bible, but why? And what difference does the application make? This is really about who we are as the church and what we do as the church and the different ways in which the culture is asking us to practice today. So I thought this is a very practical discussion for this year's Lent. So I hope it's fruitful for you, and we'll look forward to joining together again.